In February 1960, France launched its first atomic bomb in Algeria, exposing nearly 24,000 people to radiation. Unfortunately, the full extent of the contamination's impact and the true cost it incurred have yet to be officially disclosed by France. Additionally, the coordinates of all testing sites and the whereabouts of radioactive waste, which has spread throughout the country or been buried just a few feet beneath the surface, have not been made public. Regrettably, during the early 20th century, French explorers employed slave labor in regions such as the Central African Republic, Chad, and the Republic of Congo. Inspired by the brutal policies enacted by Belgium during their rule in Congo, France implemented similar strategies, granting concessions to private companies. Tragically, these companies subsequently engaged in crimes against humanity in their relentless pursuit of profits. We've grown accustomed to these reports due to the savagery of the wars that continue to rage throughout the region and beyond. However, one feature of colonialism that strikes me as particularly cruel is the attempt to destroy one's sense of self and culture as a type of collective punishment or in the service of a civilizing objective. I know I shouldn't be surprised, but reading accounts of colonialism and the atrocities committed by European nations throughout their colonial territories leaves me speechless. The French, in particular, never ceases to astonish me for a nation so dedicated to preaching the superiority and beauty of its cultural legacy and Enlightenment worth. France has a strong reputation for being one of the world's most powerful industrial nations. Some of the most well-known aspects of France outside of its borders are its wine and fashion industries, which have had a significant impact on the manufacturing sector. As Europe's top agricultural producer, France cannot be mentioned without praising its outstanding cuisine. The Western European country is also recognized as one of the most historically significant countries in both Europe and the world. With past colonies in every part of the globe, France has played a vital role in global affairs. There are two significant phases in the history of French colonial power. During the first phase of its development, France focused primarily on North America, the Caribbean, and India, establishing commercial operations supported by military force. France's military strength is one of the key reasons why it is still an influential country today. France boasts one of the world's most potent armed forces. The French military is highly trained and equipped with the latest technologies. It does not have the world's largest army, but is capable of achieving its goals and being a highly efficient defense system. The second phase commenced with the colonization of Algeria in 1830, followed by the foundation of French Indochina and a succession of military triumphs in the scramble for Africa, where it acquired control over regions spanning a significant portion of West Africa, Central Africa, and the Maghreb. Connections between France and Africa span several centuries and have had a significant impact on both regions. Several crimes have occurred throughout the history of France's colonial legacy in Africa, highlighting the systemic oppression and disregard for the lives of African people. It is not news that European nations treated slaves inhumanely throughout the slave trade and colonial era, but France's treatment of its African colonial possessions is noteworthy coming from a country that is so dedicated to extolling the superiority and elegance of its cultural legacy and values of humanism. The French administration likes to paint a rosy picture of their country's colonial past, so to someone unaware of its past and present-day relations in its Western and Central African ex-colonies, it appears to be the ideal country. It is quite unfortunate that time has failed to make amends for the colonial-era crimes committed by France in Africa. As many as 29 countries on the continent that were under French control are still seeking compensation for the violations and the restitution of the resources that were taken from their homelands. France was the third most dynamic power involved in the transatlantic slave trade, sending roughly 1.3 million Africans to the New World on French-flagged ships. Millions of Africans were forcibly removed from their homes and enslaved during its colonial era, resulting in the population collapse of cities and communities. France forced its language and culture on Africans, keeping them uneducated and impoverished. Enslaved work conditions in French colonies were particularly dangerous due to poor living conditions, famines, and disease. Although times have changed, Africa, the principal victim of the slave trade, continues to carry the cultural and psychological consequences of the trade. Although France justified the practice by saying it was a necessity to save the black race from ignorance, the fundamental motive for it seemed to be economic. France required a large and hardy workforce to produce sugarcane, coffee, cotton, and tobacco, which were the main colonial products that enriched Europe for a long time, and thanks to its colonies, the Kingdom of France became the world's largest exporter of sugar, coffee, and cotton in the 18th century. France's brutal colonization in Africa. French colonization in Africa began in modern-day Senegal, Madagascar, and along the Mascarene Islands, with a focus on the plantation economy and slave labor. Although the French presence in Africa dates back to the late 16th century, the principal period of colonial development began with the conquest of Algeria in the 19th century. While the prohibition of the slave trade appeared to be a step forward toward better living conditions in the 19th century, it did not mean the end of French exploitation of African lands and resources. France's role in Algeria, in particular, has remained a contentious issue. The North African country was first colonized in 1830, and it afterward became part of French national territories. When Algeria sought independence, France suppressed the Algerian National Liberation Front using horrific means such as torture and arbitrary imprisonment. The Algerian Independence War took the lives of hundreds of thousands of people, predominantly on the Algerian side, and eventually resulted in the end of French sovereignty in 1962. Approximately at the same time, France was compelled to lose control of its other colonies, owing mostly to the success of independence movements. Similar to Algeria, Cameroon is one of the African nations that has long endured the detrimental influence of French colonization. However, Cameroon differs significantly from Algeria in that the majority of evidence of the crimes and abuses committed by the French generals and their goons against a population devoid of both defense and subsistence has been destroyed. From 1916 to 1960, France occupied Cameroon. Particularly following the emergence of the Union of the Peoples of Cameroon, UPC, party's resistance, it destroyed communities and killed their people. The army targeted the Bamileke people who supported the UPC, according to Max Baudet, a former soldier who served in Cameroon as a pilot between 1962 and 1964. Max Baudet, testifying to France's discretion, stated that the officer accompanying him wanted to be reassured that there were no witnesses to the account on the ground so that France would not be implicated. In addition, France bears responsibility for one of the most fatal genocides in global history, which claimed the lives of 800,000 ethnic Tutsis in Rwanda. Historians, human rights organizations, and other observers have alleged that the French provided guns to the Hutus following the commencement of the Turquoise Operation on June 23, 1994. Senegal, a West African country, witnessed the Thiaroye massacre, in which French soldiers massacred Senegalese riflemen who had served France in World War II. They were killed because they demanded allowances and pensions. Instead of being rewarded, they were herded up in front of self-propelled guns and slaughtered on December 1, 1944, according to historians. Although former French President François Hollande claimed in 2014 that 70 riflemen had been slain, the figures are still being debated. Families of other riflemen have stated that the French government is aware of further mass graves and has requested that the atrocity be closed by naming the graves, but the French government has been attempting to conceal the facts. The harsh realities of violent conquest, economic exploitation, legal inequality, and socio-cultural disruption contrasted sharply with a rhetorical commitment to the civilization of indigenous peoples through cultural, political, and economic reform. Following World War II, French colonialism, notably in Africa, lost its ability to maintain control over the colonies. It was swiftly losing control over them, and severe chaos and disaster appeared to be on the way. However, France was hesitant to grant its colonies complete independence. The French believed that their colonies should not benefit from the infrastructure and other commodities that they developed there. To prevent the colonies from benefiting from French advancements, they burned and destroyed everything that they could not take back to their country. In Guinea, for example, French colonists destroyed buildings and libraries, burned food, and slaughtered cows. Guinea had to incur all that price simply because Ahmed Sékou Touré, a Guinean politician, wanted independence for the nation. Other colonies seeking independence suffered the same fate, with similarly horrendous actions. Some face French opposition in the form of coups against elected administrations. France set a prime instance, and other colonies were coerced into signing treaties with their imperial governments. The French recognized that African independence was unavoidable, and they were well prepared for a post-colonial stranglehold on their former colonies. France accorded her colonies independence, but this liberty was not without conditions. The colonies were required to sign treaties that bound them to France, its educational system, military, and commercial inclinations. The French government did not want to dissolve the links, so it had to find new ways to keep the empire running. Before the end of its colonialism, it instituted a new form of control, economic and political colonialism. France's tight stranglehold on its former colonies. Following the abolition of slavery, massive compensations were paid to former slave owners in France. These were used in part to establish colonial banks in Africa, which were later joined by others to assure that French dominance would continue post-slavery by upholding the colonial pact. The colonies' economy were intentionally underdeveloped, forcing them to rely on raw material exports and a French monopoly on shipping, exports, and imports. The CFA franc was the currency devised by France to ensure French influence bounced back from colonialism's official demise. The CFA franc story by Ndongo Samba and Fanny Pigaud, translated into English as Africa's last colonial currency, is a mind-opener to help you make sense of the matter. France is being accused of being one of the main hindrances to successful African development and independence by retaining economic, political, and military influence in its former African colonies through different strategies. The weaknesses of Africa's leaders are something to consider, as well as the lack of African political ideologies and populist thinking. Since the days of slavery, France has been addicted to plundering and exploiting Africa. The colonials came and looted, helped themselves, exploited, took resources and wealth that did not belong to them, stated then French President Nicolas on July 26, 2007. They robbed the colonized of their personalities, freedom, lands, and the products of their labor. But, to this day, France continues to treat Africa in this manner. While professing to be giving help, spreading democracy, and safeguarding Africans against terrorist attacks, it fails to solve any of the people's problems, such as violence, poverty, a lack of economic prospects, bad education systems, and inadequate infrastructure. West African countries, which were formerly French colonies, rank as the poorest in the world regardless of being the richest in terms of natural resources. Under an informal strategy dubbed Francofrique, France has maintained relations with politicians and officials it installed in its former colonies following the independence revolutions of the 1950s and 1960s. The strategy also included businessmen whom France allowed to establish firms and become commercial partners for the advantage of their masters in Paris. For decades, African central banks have been required to deposit a considerable amount of their foreign currency reserves in the French treasury under the CFA franc system. A colonial tax of approximately $500 billion is paid by 14 former French colonies in Africa. These are Benin, Burkina-Faso, Côte d'Ivoire, Guinea, Mali, Niger, Senegal, Togo, Cameroon, Central African Republic, Chad, Congo, Equatorial Guinea, and Gabon. Although France has ceased its colonial strategy, its economic colonialism of several African governments continues. Using different labels and categorizations, a portion of the colony's revenue continues to make its way to the French central bank. This system permits France to take approximately 85% of the former colony's annual income. These sums are more than twice France's aid to sub-Saharan Africa. In the pretext of assistance, France essentially returns a portion of these compelled deposits to African countries. When African countries experience financial challenges, they are forced to borrow money from the French central bank as debts. African countries can recoup no more than 20% of the transferred money. If they want an increased payment, they may reject it. France claims it is the money spent on buildings and infrastructure built more than a century ago. Absurd. To top off this despicable framework, any refusal by an African ruler to pay the colonial levy frequently results in a coup. France continued to loot its former colonies even after their independence to safeguard its interest and retain a last stronghold of imperial power. Even though the removal of the CFA franc won't guarantee Africa's rapid growth and development, it will assist in preventing disdain and allegations among the region's people towards their former colonial masters. France's current policies under the CFA currency are extremely condemnable and unjust. The people of the region deserve the same rights as individuals in Europe or the United States. To achieve all of this, France must accept that it cannot maintain its imperial dominance in the 21st century and must allow Africans to live freely. France also kept military bases in several colonies even after their independence. The ex-colonies cannot join military alliances with other countries without France's approval, and in the event of a war or global catastrophe, the former colonies must send forces to aid France. Although the military is supposedly there to fight terrorism, we know that it is also there to retain some level of control over these countries. In 2011, France even utilized military force to establish the politics it desired in Côte d'Ivoire. Nonetheless, coups in a half-dozen former French colonies in West and Central Africa have sparked deep thought regarding France's relationship with Africa over the last 3 years. Several West African countries have recently sought to cut military ties with France, urging that French troops exit the region. Since the military deposed its pro-France president, Niger has experienced an upsurge in anti-French attitudes. Despite President Emmanuel Macron's efforts, France's influence in West Africa is declining. The prior imperial power appears to be fading in the Sahel. Since the coup in Niger, many Western and African countries have expressed concern over France's relations with their country. The defeat in Niger jeopardizes the country's entire West African stance, both militarily and politically. France must discontinue its long-standing practice of stealing and exploiting African countries' resources. It should break free from the traces of a colonial mindset and allow African countries to make decisions regarding their monetary and financial policies. It might as well withdraw its military troops from the region so that the inhabitants of the region can feel self-sufficient. France's time in Africa is up. France can no longer dictate terms as certain African nations sever connections and forge new ones with foreign adversaries such as Russia. Unplugging away from Africa would reduce France's worldwide standing, but the fact is that France, similar to Britain, has an abundance of capabilities and, frankly, other concerns that better reflect its interests.